The subject of Mandela effects asks if you can trust your own memory. If there's no evidence that something happened, but you remember it happening, would you still believe it happened? The Mandela effect describes instances where many people remember something that didn't happen, or didn't happen the way they remember it. This ranges from names being spelled differently to locations of events. Normally, this can be explained as simply misremembering something, but some believe there's a darker cause for Mandela effect instances, such as testing how much people will trust their own memory over evidence. Number 10. One of the most popular and famous Mandela effects concerns a 90s kids film that never existed. The movie Shazam is one of the most discussed Mandela effect instances in communities that discuss the topic. Even when the alleged star of the movie has publicly stated that it never existed, that hasn't stopped people from believing their own memories of the fictional movie. According to those impacted by this Mandela effect, the movie Shazam came out in the early 90s. It starred comedian Sinbad, who played a genie released from a lamp or a vase by two children. The discussion surrounding this Mandela effect started simply by someone asking if anybody else remembered the movie where Sinbad played a genie. Lots of people did, but couldn't quite remember the name. Eventually, the name Shazam became attached to the movie, and this later became the name of Sinbad's character. Not much of the plot of the movie is remembered. It's likely that a lot of people's memories are influenced by other people describing their own version of the plot. The general consensus is that it featured two children who found Shazam's lamp or vase in the attic and released him. At first they were scared, but he managed to calm them down and told them about their wishes. Over the course of the movie, they make wishes and wish that their father would find love again after their mother passes away. Overall, the movie plot doesn't sound too out of the ordinary. A few people remembered watching the film repeatedly as a child, but couldn't find it in any of their collections. Sinbad and his children have categorically denied it existing. Sinbad even pointed out on social media that nobody his age, who would have been adults when the film came out, remember it existing. There are a few explanations for this Mandela effect. The first is the movie Shazam. Shazam was released in 1996 and stars Shaquille O'Neal as the genie. The plot in this story is slightly different, with the genie being discovered by a boy in trouble with the local gang, who eventually reconnects with his father with the genie's help. The movie wasn't commercially successful, but it did come out around the same time, and it has the same art style for the movie posters that seems really similar to those suggested for Shazam. But people who remember the Shazam film claim that they remember watching both. They preferred Shazam and believed that Shazam was more of a ripoff of the earlier non-existent film. Another suggestion is that confusion came from a short skit that Sinbad did, where he dressed as a genie. But again, people denied that this is what they remembered. Since the Mandela effect has become more well-known, Sinbad himself has poked fun at it. On April 1st of 2017, found footage from the film was released by the comedian channel College Humor. The film stars Sinbad and goes along with the general plot points mentioned in the Mandela effect community. It was just an April Fool's joke and featured other well-known Mandela effect Easter eggs. Some believe that Shazam really did exist, and Sinbad has been a part of covering it up as he saw it as a failure. But still, no footage, posters, or VHS tapes have ever been found to confirm that it did exist. Number 9. King Tut's mask is one of the most iconic images of ancient Egypt, and has been representative of what we imagine ancient pharaohs to look like since it was discovered 100 years ago. Most people can clearly picture it without needing to see a reference image, or at least they think they can. In reality, many people miss out on an important factor of the mask. The mask, along with the rest of King Tut's tomb, was discovered by archaeologist Howard Carter in 1922. At that point, most Egyptologists thought they'd found all there was to discover in the Valley of the Kings, but Carter believed there was something else hidden beneath the sands. He and his team located a tomb that was still sealed, an extremely rare find. Most ancient Egyptian tombs were broken into in antiquity. The fact that this tomb was found intact is one of the few reasons King Tut is known today. In ancient Egypt, he was a relatively unimportant king who was underage for most of his rule. What was done while he was on the throne was mostly the work of his regents, and he passed away at a very young age for reasons that are still unknown. It could be that King Tut's lack of fame in his lifetime was one of the reasons why his tomb was still preserved. Ancient tomb robbers were simply uninterested in what was there. Whatever the reason, the tomb was still untouched when European archaeologists found it. Inside, as well as the many artifacts designed to help the old king in the afterlife, they found King Tut's sarcophagus. It took some effort to extract the mummy from the sarcophagus, along with the golden mask, but it was eventually pulled away. The mask is designed to show what King Tut would have looked like in life. The pharaoh is wearing the famous Nemes headdress, a blue and gold striped headcloth that falls down to his shoulders. In the center is a golden snake with a blue and orange hood, and then beside that is a golden vulture's head. This vulture head is left off of many depictions of the mask, but it's been there since it was made more than 3,300 years ago. Believers in this Mandela effect insist that the snake used to be alone on the headdress and that the vulture beside it just looks off. The opinion that this is wrong may be more sensible than it first seems, even to skeptics. King Tut's mask isn't the only depiction of a pharaoh wearing the Nemes headdress with a snake in the center, and most ancient depictions only feature a snake, if they feature any animal at all. To have the vulture beside it was truly breaking from traditions, and the reasons why this was done still isn't certain. The snake, specifically a cobra, represented Lower Egypt, the area around the Nile Delta. The vulture was a symbol of Upper Egypt in the south. The simplest explanation is that the combination of these two animals represented King Tut's rule over both parts of Egypt. It's relatively well known that this was done with the crowns of Egypt. The red crown represented Lower Egypt, while the white crown represented Upper. These were then combined when the pharaohs came to rule over both parts of the land. It would make sense that something similar was done with the animals that represent these two lands. But while the double crown was worn by all the kings that ruled a unified Egypt, this isn't the case with the two animals. Even when Egypt was united, the snake and vulture didn't appear together in depictions of the pharaoh, except in the case of King Tut. Someone in ancient Egypt decided to break the tradition to put these two animals together. One suggestion is that Egypt was going through a tumultuous time when King Tut ruled and passed away. It was his father who'd created chaos when he banned the worshipping of gods other than the sun god Aten. There had been two mysterious pharaohs between Akhenaten and King Tut, and he hadn't produced an heir to succeed him. His successor would be the fifth pharaoh in 12 years, and in just a few decades the dynasty would come to an end. It could be that King Tut's successor, A, was trying to show that the country was still united. It would be a display of force to those attending the funeral, and a message to those in Upper Egypt who may have been thinking about breaking away. There's also the theory that the mask, along with many artifacts found in King Tut's tomb, were designed for Nefertiti or someone else. Royal women wore vultures on their crowns, so it could be that this had been put in place for Akhenaten's famous queen, only to be adjusted when it was used for King Tut. Or the Mandela effect affected only the most famous of ancient Egyptian rulers, and the fact that this is an anomaly is a sign that it was never supposed to look like that. Number 8. Many Mandela effects seem to focus on things that are relatively inconsequential, like the spelling of certain words or how logos appear. But some change important moments in history for many people. Of course, the most famous of these is the man the effect was named after, Nelson Mandela, but he isn't the only one. Another disturbing Mandela effect concerns a man whose identity remains a mystery. Since 1989, Tank Man has become a symbol of protest around the world. Between April 15th and June 4th of that year, students in Beijing, China demonstrated against their government. The students called for greater freedoms and democracy, and for the government to be held accountable. After months of demonstrations and protests, troops were deployed to Tiananmen Square, where the protests were being held. The exact number of protesters who lost their lives remains unknown even 30 years later, but it's believed the number reaches the thousands. By June 5th, the government and the military had largely regained control of the situation, but not everyone was going to let them get their own way. At about noon that day, a column of tanks left the square and headed east on Chang'an Avenue. The journey took them past the Beijing Hotel, where Western journalists were staying. As one journalist filmed from one of the windows, a man stepped out into the road. He calmly walked to the center of the avenue, carrying plastic grocery bags in each hand, and stood directly in the path of the oncoming tanks. The footage was smuggled out of China and shared around the world. It appeared on news programs in the West, and some remember being completely horrified by what they saw. For most people, this was an act of peaceful protest that remarkably didn't turn violent. The man gestured with the bags for the tanks to turn around. The lead tank tried to maneuver around the protester, only for the tank man to sidestep back into the path. He then climbed up onto the tank, seemed to talk to whoever was inside, and then climbed back down. Again, the tank tried to continue on its path, and again the tank man stepped in front of it. After a few minutes of this standoff, people ran out from the crowd and pulled the tank man out of the way. Who these people were also remains unknown. Most people believe they were police in civilian clothing, while there is hope that they were simply civilians who didn't want the man to get in trouble. The man has never been identified, possibly due to the censorship from within China surrounding the entire event. Outside China, he remains a symbol of protest, standing up against those that seem more powerful. But for some people, those influenced by the Mandela effect, the footage of Tank Man was something else entirely. What was shown on TV wasn't a man who managed to stop a column of tanks, but someone who lost his life protesting. Many people remember being horrified by just how disturbing the images shown were, and went into detail describing what they could see. One commenter on Reddit remembered how his school had offered counseling for the people who saw the images broadcast on TV, as they were so disturbing. Another person believed that the tank man became the symbol of the protest, as he was the only person who was actually hurt during it. In their memory, the Tiananmen Square protest had been remarkably peaceful, and one of their fellow students even conducted a study looking into why another uprising became violent when this protest didn't. The disturbing image of Tank Man being struck by the tank was an outlier in an otherwise peaceful protest. To them, videos of Tank Man climbing on top of the tank look like strange CGI, while the image of him losing his life is ingrained in their memory. This is one of the stranger Mandela effects. The image that people affected by the effect remember would be so horrific that it would be hard for them to have created that memory from their own imagination. But there also doesn't seem to be any footage of something that they may have been getting mixed up. Number 7. The Challenger space shuttle disaster is an event that's imprinted in a lot of people's memories, especially Americans who grew up in the 80s. But many were shocked to discover that those memories aren't as accurate as people thought they were. For a long time, the Challenger was one of those events where everybody remembered where they were when they first heard about it. For school children in 1986, that was often the classroom. By this point, shuttle launches happened relatively often. The Space Shuttle program was launched in 1977, with its first manned flight in 1981. In that time, there had been 24 launches, and the 25th wasn't supposed to be anything out of the ordinary from a technical standpoint. The astronauts aboard were set to study Halley's Comet, while the shuttle delivered a communications satellite. But there would be a more unusual person aboard the flight for the 25th shuttle launch. In 1984, Ronald Reagan launched the Teacher in Space project, with the aim of making a teacher the first private citizen to go to space. Thousands of people applied to be that teacher. They were all ordinary teachers working in the US who would get to go to space and teach a lesson live while aboard the shuttle. After a rigorous process, Christina McAuliffe from Massachusetts was chosen to be the first teacher in space. She described the upcoming trip as the ultimate field trip and had 2 lessons planned for the trip. The first was about the shuttle itself and what the astronauts did there. The second was about the benefits of the space program and what advantages it would have in the future. As part of the program, schools across America were given special satellite dishes by NASA. This would allow them to tune into the lessons and to watch the launch itself. Outside the classroom, only CNN had been prepared to show the full launch live. Other channels cut away seconds after takeoff and had moved on to other things when the disaster happened. 73 seconds into the flight, the shuttle was torn apart after an O-ring seal failure caused by the low temperatures before takeoff. Sadly, all 7 of the crew, including McAuliffe, lost their lives. Millions of children were watching live as it happened. Years and even decades later, people were able to clearly remember where they were. People could describe the classroom they were in, the teacher who was with them when they saw the disaster, and even the reactions of teachers and students. For people affected by this Mandela effect, this is when the problem starts, because for a lot of people, their memories place them in classrooms and with teachers that indicate the launch and disasters happened in 1984. For example, one Reddit user remembered, quote, "In 1986, I was in high school, and I distinctly remember watching it in middle school. Who the teacher was who hustled over to turn off the video. Some of my classmates crying, including 3 whose dads were transferred and didn't go to high school with me." This story is similar to those from other people who remember the 1984 date. Most of the people impacted by this Mandela effect were children at the time. It can be easy to dismiss as people misremembering what happened to them in childhood, but it's also easier for memories to be placed in specific years during school years than as adults. There might be a few major events in adulthood that would allow someone to place something at a set year. For instance, if it happened before a move or shortly before a wedding. But if there isn't that factor, then for adults, a day in 1984 would be similar to a day in 1986. For children, changing school teachers every year makes it easier to place an event like this at a specific time. 1984 would involve different teachers, a different classroom, and possibly even a different school entirely compared to 1986. It's also strange that almost all the people affected by this Mandela effect remember 1984 as the year, rather than 85 or some other date. As Reagan was in office from 1981, it would be possible for him to have launched the Teachers in Space program 2 years before he did, in reality in 1982, which would have made the earlier shuttle date possible. Those who remember it happening in 1986, as it did in our timeline, or in reality, also have clear and distinctive memories of where they were when it happened, placing them in the same classroom they would have been in for the correct date. If the Mandela effect is accepted as real, this would suggest people who remember the dates differently existed in 2 different timelines or realities, where history was slightly different, only for those 2 realities to merge or cross over at some point. Alternatively, there's some kind of mass memory problem, causing the same false memory, which is an equally fascinating concept. Number 6. Most Mandela effects are focused on pop culture, and it's unsurprising that a huge number of them come from Disney products. It seems like almost every Disney movie is slightly different to what people remember, but one of the biggest changes is something that would appear in every movie. Most Disney opening animations feature a bright dot or star, tracing the arch and the name simply appearing. There are some variations where other objects create the arch, such as a paper airplane that creates the arch in the short Paper Man. But for many people, that dot or star should be Tinkerbell. People distinctly remember Tinkerbell flying over the castle, creating the arch, before tracing out the name Walt Disney and dotting the I with her wand. This introduction has never been found, despite hundreds of people remembering it. There are dozens of Disney variations for various movies and movie trailers, but none of them come close to what people remember. There are some where it seems like the dot or star is supposed to be Tinkerbell, such as the introduction of Return to Neverland, where shimmering dust falls from the arch. The dust resembles the fairy dust from the movie, but the thing creating the dust is just a dot, rather than a complete animated character. This version also doesn't include Tinkerbell creating the name or dotting the I with her wand. Even if a single variation, which is exactly what people remember, was found, it's unlikely this would be satisfying to people who remember this alternate opening. People impacted by this Mandela effect insist all traditional Disney introductions featured Tinkerbell, not just the occasional variation. This version was so common that there were even variations to it when Tinkerbell's wand would occasionally stop working, and she would have to hit it to make it work again. This truly baffles a lot of people, as it was a regular part of their childhood growing up. It makes people question their own memory if something they see every day is different to how they remember it. An animator created a mock-up of what the Tinkerbell introduction may have looked like based on the memories of a lot of people impacted by this Mandela effect. Most agreed this was something like what they remembered, but it still didn't sit right for many. Number 5. Lots of Mandela effects concern when somebody passed away. Many people think famous celebrities lost their lives decades before they actually did. But not all Mandela effects on the topic involve the timing. The case of John Denver is a strange one. Denver is known as the country music star that made the genre more mainstream. His song "Country Road Take Me Home" reached number 1 and has since become iconic. Even those who don't know the singer himself have likely heard his songs. Another hit for Denver was the song "Rocky Mountain High," which came out in 1972. Away from his music, Denver's interest was in airplanes, and it was in this way that he would lose his life. He had a pilot's license and had flown many different types of planes. In 1997, he began a flight in his own experimental aircraft, an amateur-built Long Easy plane. This type of plane had a few problems, but the biggest was the handle used to switch between gas tanks, which was hard to reach. On the morning of October 12th, Denver left the Monterey Peninsula in California. He didn't go through the proper pre-flight checks and had to switch fuel tanks shortly after takeoff. There was no distress signal, but shortly after takeoff, an accident happened. The wreck of his plane was quickly located with Denver inside, and he had passed away on impact. It was later discovered that Denver's license had been suspended before he got onto the plane. He'd been involved in a few incidents of driving a road car under the influence of alcohol. The investigation after the crash found that there was no alcohol or illegal substances in his system. It's believed that Denver was so focused on changing the fuel tank that he lost control of the plane. Added to the other experimental elements of the plane, it came together to cause a tragic accident. The subject of this Mandela effect is where the accident happened. The official version of events is that the accident occurred over Monterey Bay. His plane was located just 150 yards from the shoreline. This location makes sense, given where the takeoff happened, and the fact that there doesn't seem to have been much time between takeoff and the accident occurring. Other people remember hearing a different story. Instead of flying out over the ocean, Denver flew inland. The people impacted by this Mandela effect remember Denver's plane coming down in a mountain. Some believe the accident happened in the mountains, but the pilot actually landed in a mountain lake, combining the water and mountain elements. Those who remember this series of events remember people commenting on the irony, given Denver's hit song "Rocky Mountain High." People who don't believe this Mandela effect believe Denver's association with the mountains due to his music is what makes people think that this is where the accident happened. After his funeral, Denver's remains were scattered in the Rocky Mountains, another association between Denver and the mountains that could have remained in people's minds. These associations would explain why people made comments about irony in this situation. It could be that the people making these comments were just misinformed about what actually happened, and the people who remember Denver's accident happening in the mountains simply received bad information. But it seems unlikely that so many people received this same bad information. There is a reference to the collision in the popular TV show South Park, which has been used as evidence for both versions of events. The references involved an aircraft hitting multiple objects in front of a mountain backdrop before landing in a pool of water. The water lines up with the official version of events, but some have argued that the contact with other objects suggests that the writers remembered Denver's accident taking place at a mountain lake. Another suggested explanation is that people mixed up Denver with another celebrity who passed away in a mountain accident. For example, former actor and singer Dean Paul Martin, who was involved in an aviation accident over the San Bernardino Mountains in 1987, and singer Shirley Strachan, who had an accident in the mountains in Australia. These memories could combine so that people who hadn't been told specifically where the accident happened imagined a mountain without any actual evidence. The Denver Mandela effect is one of the stranger ones, but also one that may have a few different explanations. Number 4. Another ancient Egyptian wonder that has apparently changed despite being thousands of years old is the pyramids at Giza. For many impacted by this Mandela effect, there's something off about the 3 pyramids and their surroundings. The Great Pyramid of Giza is one of the ancient wonders of the world. It was built by Pharaoh Khufu during his reign more than 4,500 years ago. For a long time, it was the largest man-made structure in the world, beaten only in 1311 by the Lincoln Cathedral in England. His successors also built pyramids on the Giza Plateau. His son, Khafra, built the second Great Pyramid on the plateau, as well as the Sphinx, and Khafra's son, Menkaure, built the third and smallest of the pyramids. They've remained a wonder since they were first built, even if later ancient Egyptians removed the more decorative cover to use in other construction projects. Countless tourists, both in modern times and during the classical era, have gone to Cairo to visit the wonders, and it continues to be a fascination for archaeologists to this day. But some returning to look at the pyramids believe something has changed since they were first built. In fact, the change seems to have happened in the past few decades. The first change is the order of the pyramids. Everyone agrees that Khufu's pyramid was the largest, but many are under the impression that it was the central pyramid. This is the pyramid behind the Sphinx, and the only one that still has its capstone. In many images of the pyramids, it appears to be the largest, and it's easy to see how a mistake could have been made. But believers in this Mandela effect insist that it's not a matter of perspective. People who have gone to visit the pyramids have also remarked that the central pyramid was always the largest, and on either side were two much smaller pyramids. Menkaure's pyramid is much smaller than his grandfather's, but people remember Khafra's as being much smaller. In fact, there's only about a 2-meter difference between the two pyramids. Another reason why this seems off to some people is that they believe the pyramids were built in alignment with Orion's belt. This theory has existed since the 80s. The two largest pyramids, if superimposed over the images of the constellation, do seem to line up closely. The third, smaller pyramid is a little off. There's no evidence that this was intentional, and considering how the night sky would have changed in the thousands of years since the pyramids were made, it's likely just a coincidence. But this correlation, whether a coincidence or not, is also used as evidence for the Mandela effect. People claim that the central star in Orion's belt is the largest or brightest star. It wouldn't make sense for the pyramids of Giza to be compared to this constellation if that central pyramid wasn't the largest or most impressive. One of the main criticisms of Mandela effects, especially ones that concern physical locations or historical events, is that they're mostly experienced by people in other countries, other than the one where the effect takes place. Skeptics claim that only people outside South Africa, specifically Americans, remember Nelson Mandela passing away in prison. But distance or lack of knowledge on the subject doesn't seem to be a factor in this effect. A Reddit user working in the Persian Gulf brought up the topic of this Mandela effect. Not only had they been to visit the pyramids, but they also worked with a lot of Egyptians. When asking the people about the order of the pyramids, they were amazed to find that the central pyramid wasn't the largest. Other people who've experienced this Mandela effect include those who have studied Egyptology in the past, so they should be familiar with the layout of the Giza Plateau. It isn't only the 3 giant pyramids that are causing confusion, though. Other structures on the plateau also seem off to some. One of the biggest of these is the 3 pyramids that sit south of the pyramid of Menkaure. These are called the Pyramids of the Queens and feature quite prominently in photos taken of the Great Pyramids. Only one is a true pyramid, with the other 2 being step pyramids that don't seem to have been fully completed. For many, these pyramids seem to have appeared out of nowhere and didn't feature in people's memories. People have remarked how they would have remembered the step pyramids, as they thought they only existed in South and Central America. Another strange construction is the Giza Solar Boat Museum. This was built between 1961 and 1982 on the southern side of the Great Pyramid, and houses a reconstruction of one of the ships that were buried around the pyramid. The modern building, compared to the ancient pyramids around it, stands out, but people who have visited the pyramids don't remember it at all. One Reddit user commented how they had visited the pyramids for several days and ridden camels around them, but neither they nor any of their friends remembered seeing the museum. It also didn't appear in any of the photos they took from the trip. Giza isn't the only place where pyramids seem out of place. Another pyramid that has appeared from nowhere, according to those impacted by the Mandela effect, is the Red Pyramid. The red pyramid is located at Dashur, about a kilometer away from the bent pyramid. It's easily visible from the bent pyramid, and was the tallest building ever made until the Great Pyramid at Giza was built. But people who have visited the bent pyramid have no memory of seeing this perfect pyramid nearby. Overall, the layout of these ancient structures doesn't seem to match up with how they should look, even to people who should be familiar with the subject. Number 3. Lots of Mandela effects can be attributed to poor memory, or just poor knowledge of the subject to begin with. One of the less convincing explanations is the Mandela effects that impact our own bodies. People who experience this Mandela effect are puzzled about why things they learned at school about their own bodies are no longer accurate. Some even believe they've experienced the change in real time. The first and most famous of these anatomy Mandela effects is that of the human heart. A lot of people remember learning that their heart was on the left side of their chest. This is why during the Pledge of Allegiance or while taking an oath, people will place their hand on their left side. Images of people gripping their chest to symbolize a heart attack show them gripping the left side. Medals and crests on sports shirts are also displayed on the left side. There's definitely an association with the heart being on the left side of the body, and it's even taught that the left lung is smaller to accommodate this. But the heart is in the center of the chest. Only the left ventricle is slightly to the left, and the left lung is only slightly smaller. One Reddit user commented how they'd noticed their heart change position years before they knew about the Mandela effect. They can no longer feel it when they place their hand over the left side of their chest. They assumed this was due to being in better physical health, only to later realize it was because the heart was now in the center of the chest. The heart isn't the only organ to have changed positions. People believe the kidneys were once much lower in the back. In reality, they're much higher up in the chest, only slightly below the lungs. The intestines also look strange. People picture the long organ being folded neatly on itself, forming a horizontal zigzag pattern, before being circled by the large intestine. The large intestine still encircles the small intestine, but the small intestines are no longer neatly folded. It looks strange and messy, and not at all like something naturally made. It's not only organs that people believe have been changed by the Mandela effect. The skeleton that encases them is also changed. Starting with the skull, people are amazed to discover that there's a bone behind the eye sockets. Lots of people imagine this being an empty cavity, with the back of the skull being visible through the socket. There are actually many pieces of bone behind the eye, and only 2 small fissures in each socket, which allow the eye to connect with the brain. This new structure makes a lot more sense, considering how delicate our eyes and what's behind them are. This would help protect the brain and keep everything in place. The rib cage also seems different to a lot of people. People remember the ribs attaching to the rest of the skeleton at the spine, then curving around and stopping, with a small gap between the ribs and sternum in the center of the chest. Many are shocked to discover this isn't the case. The ribs come all the way around the body and attach at the center of the chest. Only the 11th and 12th ribs are considered floating. This means they're attached at the spine, not at the front of the body. But these ribs don't reach all the way around to the front, and don't simply stop with a small gap to the sternum as some people imagine. There is another apparent change to the body that makes a lot more sense than what people suffering from this Mandela effect remember. It's safer for these bones to be attached in 2 places rather than 1, and having the gap between the ribs and sternum doesn't provide any biological advantage. This Mandela effect could be chalked up to people not studying anatomy closely. Most people only study anatomy in high school, and after that, the skeletons they see are often just cartoons which can be inaccurate. But there are people who claim to work in the medical field who have also noticed this change, and that wouldn't explain why we feel kidney pain in the lower back, and why we associate the left side of the chest with the heart so significantly, or why people were apparently able to feel their heartbeat change place. Number 2. In the 1960s and 70s, visitors to the Bolton Museum in England were greeted by an amazing sight. Towering above them was a model of a dinosaur skeleton displayed in full. Or at least that's what many people remembered. In reality, it wasn't until the 2010s that the Bolton Museum got its first dinosaur skeleton. The story begins sometime around 1992. That year, the local newspaper, Bolton Evening News, received dozens of phone calls from confused locals who believed an important part of their city's museum had disappeared without warning. People remembered visiting the museum in the 1960s and 70s, with the earliest story coming from 1967. Most people remembered either a Brontosaurus or Tyrannosaurus rex, with the T-Rex being the most popular of the two. All stories involved the dinosaur standing in the entranceway to the museum, and it being a major attraction, especially to children who would go to the museum on school field trips. One visitor even remembered a detail about one of the teeth having been replaced, as it was much wider compared to the rest of the skeleton. When exactly it disappeared is unclear, but it seems to have gone missing in the 1980s or early 1990s. Among the people who remembered the dinosaur was Alan Rushton, who was a local counselor in 2006. He remembered visiting the museum as a schoolboy and being in awe of the dinosaur. When he was part of the council's arts committee, he brought up the dinosaur to try to get to the bottom of its disappearance, but no trace of it could be found. This wasn't the case of someone stealing a giant dinosaur replica, or even the museum secretly selling it without informing anyone. The museum itself had no records of the dinosaur replica, and museum curators couldn't even remember it being there. The possibility that it had been loaned from the British National History Museum was explored. This isn't too uncommon, and the famous Dippy, the Diplodocus, has been on tour around the United Kingdom since 2017. But there would be records of something like that happening, and none have been found. There also don't appear to be any photographs of the dinosaur at the museum. The Bolton Museum has photographs from its initial opening in the 1930s, and there was no sign of the dinosaur there. But as the dinosaur was such a major attraction, it's surprising that no photographs were taken. By the 1970s, cameras were commonplace enough for families to take one along on a visit to a museum. A photo of children in front of the mysterious dinosaur would have been a popular souvenir, but no photos appear to exist. Despite the lack of evidence, a survey taken in 2006 showed that roughly 50% of people remembered there being a dinosaur at Bolton Museum. One explanation could be that people are remembering seeing a dinosaur at another museum. The nearby Manchester Museum has fossils and dinosaur galleries. It's possible that people visited this museum instead of, or as well as, the Bolton Museum, and the two memories were merged together. The distance would have been short enough for school trips to have been feasible, and many school children would likely have visited the larger museum. But that explanation is likely one that would have been considered by authorities trying to locate the missing dinosaur. What makes this Mandela effect so interesting is just how niche it is. Unlike the pyramids at Giza or Disney animations, this is one that only a relatively small group of people would have been able to experience. Only a small number of people would have visited the Bolton Museum in the 60s and 70s, and they're the only ones who can say for certain, one way or another, if the dinosaur existed. It's also one that appeared in local newspapers, and isn't simply people on the internet debating their own memories. There are likely many other Mandela effect stories like this that are only known to a small group of locals that we may never know about. Number 1. The Statue of Liberty has stood in New York since 1886, and since then has attracted millions of visitors. The statue is supposed to be a memorial to America's independence and a celebration of the abolition of slavery. It was and still is a symbol for many of freedom and democracy. There have been some restorations and renovations over the years, and the statue's original torch now sits in a museum. But many believe that there have been some other changes that aren't acknowledged today. The first is the location of the famous statue. The statue was the idea of Frederick Auguste Bartholdi, who wanted to give America a gift to celebrate its centennial. As Bartholdi designed the iconic statue, he traveled to America to find the perfect location where it could be placed. The location he found would have been one of the first he came across after arriving in New York. Like many visitors to the US at the time, he arrived in New York by a ship. The ship sailed through the Upper Bay and up the Hudson River, passing a few islands as it did so. One of the first islands passed was Bedloe Island, named after a Dutch colonist who had purchased it in 1667. To Bartholdi, it was perfect. New arrivals in America would have to pass by the statue as they entered the country. Even better was the fact that it was owned by the state government. The island was technically in New Jersey waters, but the land above the water was owned by New York. There was some army activity there, including a star-shaped fort that had been built about 60 years earlier, but not much else. Permission was granted, and Bedloe Island became the home of the famous statue. In 1956, the island's name would be changed to recognize the famous landmark. This name change was to Liberty Island. The name makes sense, but for a lot of people, it's surprising to find out that the Statue of Liberty is on the island. Many people remember the statue being on Ellis Island. Ellis Island sits a little way north of Liberty Island. Like Liberty Island, it's a New York island sitting in New Jersey waters, and it's also been an important point for people arriving in the US. It was here that many people moving to the country would stop for processing and quarantine before they were allowed to go any further. Today, the island features a museum dedicated to the island's history of immigration. There are a lot of similarities between the two islands. Liberty Island was also once used for processing people moving to the US, and today both are the home to memorials to an important part of New York and America's history. Emma Lazarus's poem, The New Colossus, was written for the fund of the Statue of Liberty's pedestal. Its focus is on immigration, and it's inscribed on a plaque on Liberty Island today. The two islands are even part of the same national monument, the Statue of Liberty National Monument. It's easy to see why the two are mixed up, especially for those who know Ellis Island is part of the Statue of Liberty National Monument. But for some, it's not a case of being a mix-up. They insist there was once only one island in the vicinity, Ellis Island, and that was the one that the statue was built on. They point to photos that seem to indicate the statue was closer to other monuments, as it would be if it were on Ellis Island, and a painting that leaves out Ellis Island from the background. Some even believe that this is an example of a flip-flop, where a Mandela effect hits twice. For these people, the Statue of Liberty was always on Liberty Island, but they were shocked one day to find out it was actually on Ellis Island. A short time later, they were learning that it had been on Liberty Island all along. It was almost as if some cosmic entity had made an error and then gone back to correct it. But this isn't the only Mandela effect associated with the Statue of Liberty. Millions of people visit the statue every year. For many, going to visit the statue's crown is a highlight, where groups of up to 10 people can peer out from beneath the spikes. The area has been closed at times, including between 2001 and 2009, but for the most part, it's been open to the public. It takes 162 steps up a spiral staircase to get to the crown, but that's as far as the public is able to go. There is a way to access the torch with a 40-step ladder leading up to the highest point of the monument, but that's been restricted since 1916, when an incident at a nearby armaments production site caused shrapnel to hit the arm. The fact the only way into the torch is the long, narrow ladder has also been given reason as to why it's off limits. For many, this doesn't seem right. Many people have memories of visiting the Statue of Liberty's torch. People remember visiting both the crown and the torch. Some believe that scenes from films and music videos have influenced people to believe the torch is still open, and they might have misremembered visiting this part of the statue. Others point out that it's strange that the incident at the armaments site, which was caused by German sabotage during the First World War, isn't more well known, and believe this might be part of the Mandela effect, with a cause created once the effect had been put in place. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.